in legal systems throughout the world, unlike humans, animals are considered property. Children and women used to be considered property many years ago in many countries, but now it's animals that are on that side of the fence, and ultimately trying to break out of that paradigm, because if you are only enjoying property status under the law, that's a ticket for exploitation on multiple levels, whether it's our food system, our entertainment system, our medical research system. You are a means to an end, and you don't have intrinsic value.
Randall Abate is a law professor of Monmouth University who has written multiple books on environmental law and animal rights. Links to all of those can be found in the description. So, first of all, thanks for accepting our invitation. Would you like to introduce yourself a bit further and tell us a bit what you're working at the moment?
Certainly. Thank you again for having me. I'm very excited to be on the show today. The way to characterize my work has been almost exclusively academic. I'm an environmental lawyer who became an environmental law professor. I was in environmental law practice only for 4 years, and I've been in academia for 27 years now. 24 of those years were at the law school level. So I taught at 6 law schools in the US, and the focus of my career, dating back all the way to my legal education, has been environmental law. And that started at the domestic US level for about the first 10, 15 years of my career. And then I transitioned into global dimensions of environmental law. And from there, climate change quickly became a focus of my writing and my teaching. And perhaps the most recent transition to my focus as a teacher and scholar has been animal law, and that's been about the past 7 years. So my work now is integrating these fields. So my original focus on environmental law, my later focus on international and climate change issues, and then the animal law dimension. Those 3 contexts actually come together under one roof in my Climate Change in the Voiceless book that was published last year.
So how did you make the transition from being into international law into environmental and then into animal rights?
Well, it proceeded from environmental to international to animal. So the logic behind the progression was that in part, it was just happenstance. I had my first opportunity to teach in a study abroad program in 1998 in Nairobi, Kenya. And that was the first time I got to teach international environmental law. And once I taught that course, it really just was a massive eye-opening experience for me as a teacher and a scholar to see all of the ways in which environmental law is really international by nature. It's a fundamentally transboundary issue. Environmental problems don't stay in one place, so it's actually somewhat artificial to focus exclusively on domestic environmental law when everything about a country's environmental problems are in some way global. So from there, getting into animal law was again a product of circumstance, but it also connected well to what I was already doing. So in teaching domestic and international environmental law, there was always a component of wildlife protection built into those efforts. And so animal law as a field goes far beyond protection of wildlife. It covers companion animals and animals in entertainment and agriculture. But the fact that animals were in some way part of what I addressed in those areas of environmental law, it was a logical progression to go into animal law from environmental law and bring the perspectives of environmental law into how animal law could be regulated more effectively, because it's a newer field and it's struggling more to get the political will to regulate it the way we have with environmental issues.
And how effective are international laws in general?
Well, international law is considered a bit of a black sheep among lawyers and legal scholars in many ways, because it is very aspirational by design. Much of the way international law operates is through political consensus on a global basis. So, of course, you have many more players who need to be doing their part for it to work effectively. And unlike domestic law, international law doesn't come with its own set of enforcement mechanisms. It relies on the political will and the legal frameworks of each individual nation to enforce those international mandates in their own countries. And that's where it often breaks apart, because economic priorities, shifts in political administrations, you can have great international law on the books and nothing will happen if you don't have the right circumstances in each country's legal frameworks and political cultures to implement those efforts. So in many ways, it's necessary in our globalized society. We have to have international law, but it's often got a reputation of big aspirations and little concrete results.
What sort of mechanisms and setups are there for international animal law? So obviously for human rights law, there's sort of the Geneva Convention, and in Europe we've got the European Courts of Human Rights. What sort of equivalence or setup is there for environmental and animal law?
It's certainly in its infancy compared to the human rights framework. So the human rights framework dates back to the wake of World War II. When we look at international environmental law, it's far more established than international animal law, but it traces its roots to the 1970s. There were many of our most significant international environmental law treaties coming on the books in the 1970s and 80s. And as far as tribunals go, they do exist. In many cases, the individual treaties have their own tribunals. So if you have a dispute under the Climate Change Treaty, you could go to the Climate Change Tribunal. If you have a dispute under the Law of the Sea Treaty, you go to that tribunal. You also have the International Court of Justice, where some environmental disputes are heard, not many. And then most recently, there are these different set of tribunals known as rights of nature tribunals, which are very new and non-binding compared to these other tribunals I referenced. And that's kind of the newest wave in environmental protection. And that's still got a long way to go. With global international animal law, there's absolutely nothing. So the only way animal protection disputes might get heard in a tribunal would be if they are somehow connected to other more prominent issues like environmental or trade disputes. Those can go to a trade tribunal or an international environmental tribunal, but it's very, very preliminary right now at the global level with animal protections.
So your book's called Climate Change and the Voiceless. Is that what you mean by the voiceless? The fact that these mechanisms don't exist in law? Or could you talk a bit more about what you meant by the title?
Absolutely. So the reference to voiceless can be understood many ways in the literature. Sometimes voiceless would just refer to adult human communities that are marginalized, so racial minorities or lower income, indigenous peoples. To the extent they're marginalized in the political and legal cultures, that might give them a label of voiceless. But in my book, I have three particular categories in mind when I say voiceless, and that is natural resources, wildlife, and future generations of humans. So that would be current youth and the unborn. So these three categories share one thing in common, and that is they each lack a legal voice. They cannot represent themselves in courts the way adult humans can. And so in that way, they are comparably marginalized in the context of climate change. Climate change is making all of their futures more bleak, and they don't have a legal voice to protect their interests in what kind of future they may have.
And how do you suggest that we sort of empower the communities to have a voice? Are there ways of doing that, or?
Absolutely. So the book addresses that in a variety of ways. One of the ways, the most common way, is through the courts. So the courts are just becoming aware of ways in which the voiceless can be represented to have a voice in the legal system. And a prominent example of that we're seeing worldwide are these lawsuits that are being brought by children for climate change remedies against governments that are either acting inadequately or not acting at all. And you see lawsuits brought by youth against their governments to seek a legal theory that would require the government to act. So these are politically disempowered plaintiffs. They don't have a right to vote, so they can't lobby their legislative bodies to ultimately cast a vote to get the right people in office to make the right decisions. So their only resort is to the courts. Well, the only resort in one sense is litigation. Another area where things are developing slowly would be representatives who are designated to be the voice of these groups. So in animal law in particular, we're seeing a lot of litigation where this notion of being a guardian on behalf of the animal's interest in court. Of course, the animals can't go up and speak for themselves, but designated representatives who would be the voice for that community. And that's also true for youth plaintiffs. We've seen that in other areas of the law. For instance, in family law, if you're a 5-year-old and your parents are getting a divorce, there's a guardian that's appointed to represent your best interests as to who's going to be the better parent for your future. As a 5-year-old, you're not deciding that yourself. So there's also, in the natural resources context, a big movement called rights of nature. And this is the same idea, that the notion of appointing representatives who would be the voice for that resource. And we're seeing that in New Zealand, in India, and Colombia, where rivers have been given legal rights in their own right, not because humans are affected, but they have legal rights to speak for their interests. And of course, humans are representing them in court.
And what would be like the interests of, so I can understand it for humans, can understand it to some extent for animals, but what would be the interests of rivers? And how on what basis do they defend it?
Well, essentially, the way this came to the courts was there was such a significant degree of pollution in certain water bodies. So you've got the Ganges in India, you've got the Atrato River in Colombia, and essentially cases were brought to these courts to say, let's find a way to stem the flow of this pollution, to require that it stop or diminish. And ultimately, after so many efforts to try to regulate the pollution unsuccessfully, the courts in each of those cases stepped in their own right and said, we're going to assign legal personhood to this river, because the only way to protect its integrity, to have any hope for viability in the future, would be for it to have its own voice and not wait for humans to do the right thing on its behalf. So basically, the whole idea about what kind of sustainable future we can hope for very much is reflected in this rights of nature movement, that we are doomed if we rely on humans to do the right thing on behalf of nature. We won't have a planet in a century if we only rely on humans as the legal protection.
I don't mean to sort of be facetious, but like, how does a river bring a claim? How does that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a variety of ways it can be implemented through the law. So one example is in New Zealand. There's the Wanganui River in New Zealand is now represented by two guardian interests. One is the government of New Zealand, and one is the Maori tribe, who has a long relationship culturally and spiritually with that river. And so basically, this is something that's going to be worked out on a case-by-case basis. I mean, nobody knows really what the extent of protection that legal personhood would confer to this river. It may not mean you can't pollute it at all. It's going to be worked out through cases that are brought by those guardians on behalf of the river when the next threat to the river's integrity comes up.
Wouldn't it be easier if we were arguing in terms of the impacts of polluting the river on humans,
Absolutely.
As opposed to the river itself being something that needs rights.
And that's the most logical and common criticism to the framework of rights for nature, rights for animals, that it just seems to be the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, in terms of the legal system. And the response to that is when I do a book talk on my climate change and the voiceless, I trace the history of environmental protection in a way that shows that's where we've been for decades. So our environmental protection system is really nothing more than protecting the environment from harming us. And basically, we are implementing pollution control laws to diminish water pollution, air pollution, hazardous waste pollution. But the driving force behind those laws was not to protect the inherent value of the integrity of air, water, land. It was to protect ourselves from the hazards that we created by our pollution problems. So virtually all environmental laws, with a handful of exceptions, are based on this premise that we only protect the environment as a way to protect ourselves as humans. And you can see where that paradigm has gotten us. It's pushed us to the brink of ecological catastrophe, and it's an unsustainable way of trying to protect the environment if it's only through the lens of how humans are being affected by it.
So how do we keep these frameworks moving? So in Europe and the Americas, particularly in the USA and Brazil, we've seen the election of governments who have been rolling back on climate and environmental legislation. I was reading about in the US, a lot of the EPA's regulations have been cut during the pandemic. How do we continue to empower the voiceless and make progress on these laws when there are sort of climate deniers leading some of the institutions?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, and I think the 2 points I would make on that. The first is elections matter more than ever. So if you look at the upcoming elections in the US, I mean, this is by far the most significant election in our 230 plus year history. And that's true in many other countries that aren't doing as much as they should with respect to climate regulation. So you mentioned Brazil, they're certainly on that list. Australia, Canada to a lesser degree, but very much need to step up, raise their game. So elections matter more than anything, and that's not just presidents and prime ministers, that is legislative bodies, because in the US, if you look at our track record of environmental protection legislation, ironically, some of our best laws came out under Nixon, a Republican. So it's less critical who we have in the White House than it is who we have in Congress. If we can get legislation passed in a bipartisan way on climate change with who is elected to Congress in 2020, it's still a huge problem if Trump remains in office, but a far less significant one if there's Democratic control of Congress. So that's true everywhere, that there just has to be top-down regulation of this problem through the federal legislative levels to address climate change as ambitiously as we can. But that likely won't happen overnight, and it will take some time. So in the meantime, we're doing very well with bottom-up responses. And by that I mean just individual small-scale things that when you add it all up, even though the US looks like a laggard and is at the federal level with respect to climate change, when you look at what some of the states are doing in the US, California is the 7th largest economy in the world, and they are one of the most ambitious leaders on climate regulation. And there's other states like that in the US. And then at a local level, you've got many cities that are doing excellent jobs, major cities on climate regulation. And then more importantly, on an individual basis, citizens are more aware of their individual choices and how that cumulative impact also has a big outcome with respect to climate reductions. So travel choices, lodging choices, food choices, all of those things, there's much more awareness now than there ever was about everyone's climate footprint. And if everyone starts to do more of the right thing collectively, we're less reliant on our leaders to dictate that from the top.
Okay. Moving on a bit to focus on animal law. So in the UK recently, as we leave the EU, there's been a lot of debate about sort of the food standards, and I was wondering how about whether we're going to have food standards that look more like the European model or more like the federal USA model or various others. I was wondering how animal law affects other law in like food standards and relates to sort of other aspects of society.
That's a very important question. I think what motivated me in putting together the second edition of my "What Can Animal Law Learn from Environmental Law" book was that very dimension of the issue, that there was so much happening with respect to food law and policy that intersects with animal law, that there are several new chapters in the second edition of my book that address that question. So in the US, one dimension of that is with respect to food labeling, and there's really not enough information to the public to make the choices they want to make about food, about selecting things that are in their interest to purchase. And there's a big problem with deceptive advertising. So corporate America is quite sensitive to the more conscientious buyers in the market, and they are trying to convey messages about this product was humanely raised, this came from a caring dairy, this product, and ultimately what the law permits, what the law tolerates and doesn't tolerate with respect to that kind of advertising is very much a hot issue now in the courts on deceptive advertising with respect to labels. And another dimension of it is about the food production system itself. It's just fundamentally broken, how the vast majority of our food comes from factory farms that are essentially unregulated on many levels. They're a huge problem for animals, a huge problem for the environment, a huge problem for the workers in these facilities. And in the meantime, we're receiving food products that are pumped with hormones and antibiotics and produced in unsafe conditions. There was recently a measure that allowed the assembly line on factory farms to go faster this year of all times, partly in response to the growth of the plant-based food industry that's really posing a threat to the competitive edge of the traditional animal agriculture industry. So they're feeling the pressure. Some sectors of the animal agriculture industry, like Tyson and ConAgra, are actually producing their own lines of plant-based food. They see the writing on the wall. So that's really a good indication that we're at the beginning of a food revolution that's happening faster than I expected in the US. And it's very much driven by this growing awareness of how our food is produced and how we want to make more conscientious choices about our food.
So, when we're arguing for animal rights, to what extent would you argue from a moral perspective? And to what extent would you argue from a human self-interested one?
Yeah, that's been the challenge in animal law for a long time. So one of the fundamental differences between environmental law and animal law is that environmental law started with a bit of that moral imperative behind it, save the whales, no nukes, but it quickly transitioned into more of a human health focus. So all of the great successes in environmental regulation were driven by science that was telling us that we're killing ourselves from our pollution. So we got some very effective laws in place that were human focused. When you look at animal law, it's been grounded in that moral imperative, and it still has that moral imperative in much of the way it tries to regulate. That many animal advocacy groups are seeking to have laws protect animals for their own sake. All of the anti-cruelty laws that are in place are not helping humans. They're exclusively designed to make sure that humans do not harm animals because animals have a right not to be harmed. And so that's what's motivating those laws. And many of the other animal laws are trying to move away from this property concept. So in legal systems throughout the world, unlike humans, animals are considered property. children and women used to be considered property many years ago in many countries, but now it's animals that are on that side of the fence, and ultimately trying to break out of that paradigm, because if you are only enjoying property status under the law, that's a ticket for exploitation on multiple levels, whether it's our food system, our entertainment system, our medical research system. You are a means to an end, and you don't have intrinsic value.
And what do you say to people who would say, like, at the moment we have a lot of countries violating human rights? So why should, when we have so many violations of human rights, why would we want to advocate for animal rights?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's one of the biggest challenge for animal rights. The biggest challenges is that there's this, what's known as the speciesist divide. And that is this idea that humans are fundamentally different from animals. And anyone who studied evolution would laugh at you for thinking that way. But that is ultimately what makes animal law so difficult to succeed with, is that humans are running the show. We are the source of the regulation in society. So, of course, our efforts are going to be more anthropocentric in how we impose legal restrictions. They're going to be primarily, if not exclusively, designed to protect humans. And if we have any energy or time or money left over, we might also think about protecting natural resources and animals in their own right. But that's really been the biggest challenge for animals, that they are at best an afterthought when we come to thinking about what the law ought to protect, because it's a political issue and it's an economic issue. If you go to Congress with some kind of proposal that's going to make humans live more safely and in better health, that is certainly going to get much more political will behind it than if you go to Congress with something that's designed only to protect animals.
Big theme in your book is climate justice. So most people are kind of aware of the climate crisis and have an idea of the various campaigns within it. But could you explain what climate justice is and sort of how it applies?
So climate justice is a field that actually traces its roots to the field of environmental justice, which emerged in the late 80s in the US. And environmental justice was this concept that even though our environmental laws were doing a great job protecting the environment and protecting humans from the environmental threats that humans caused, there was a growing awareness that our environmental laws were not protecting classes of humans equally. So environmental justice really meant that certain environmental problems were having a disproportionate burden on certain communities. And the initial discovery was African Americans. So there were just shocking statistics that came out in the late 80s that showed that 95% of the what are called environmentally undesirable uses, landfills, medical waste incinerators, heavy industry, if you looked on the periphery of where all those environmentally undesirable uses were cited, you always found African American communities in the immediate vicinity, virtually without exception. And so that concept broadened, and it actually also included other racial and ethnic minority communities and low-income communities and indigenous communities. And so that was environmental justice that started gaining a lot of traction all the way up to about 2000 in the US. And then there was an effort to try to get our 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause to ultimately protect these populations, to say that these disproportionate burdens of pollution on these communities amounted to a violation of our Equal Protection Clause. And that did not succeed in court. It was determined to be disproportionate impact, but with no intent. So because there was no intent to burden these communities, it was just a societal reality. Ultimately, there was no protection from the Equal Protection Clause for that harm. So where it went from there was that climate change was becoming such a big issue, and we started to see more and more that same pattern of disproportionate burden on certain communities was also true with climate change. So that's where the climate justice idea came from. Whether you look at countries as a whole, low-lying island nations, if you look at the South Pacific or the Maldives, you've got places that are on the brink of going underwater, and they are some of the lowest carbon emitters in the world. And so that's a classic climate justice scenario where those that are least equipped to protect themselves, they've done the least to contribute to this global problem, they're going to go under before the rest of us. And then you also see it among communities in the Arctic, Arctic indigenous peoples who are losing their identity, their way of life, because the Arctic is melting. Again, low carbon emitters, and yet they're feeling the impacts first as climate justice communities. So that concept I then apply to the book and the voiceless and say that our law has had the ability to become more sensitive to these vulnerable communities, and really the next stage is to become more sensitive to the vulnerabilities of the voiceless, because we would have never gotten to thinking about ways to protect the voiceless if we didn't reach that intermediate step of trying to protect the vulnerable human populations around the world through environmental justice and climate justice.
So what would be an ideal international legal system, in your opinion?
Well, what I'm becoming more skeptical about with respect to climate change is that I really had high hopes that the best way to address climate change, this fundamentally global problem, would be through a very effective global climate change treaty regime. We've now seen that fail for 3 decades, and with no real hope of making serious progress with this kind of international governance of this global problem. And that's not to say I think we should give up, but what I'm becoming more of a realist about is that the most effective legal responses to climate change need to happen at the regional and national levels. Of course, there needs to be cooperation at the global level about shared goals, but ultimately that initial thought about how to regulate global climate change through this very effective global treaty regime, that's proving unworkable. There are just too many competing concerns, not enough political will, not enough willingness to sacrifice economic gains, and so forth, that what I see it coming to now is that the developed countries of the world really need to raise their game and take more of a stewardship role. They are much better positioned to not only help themselves out of this problem, but to do the right thing for vulnerable communities outside their borders as well, because it's an interconnected world. Climate change is not kind of a nation by nation problem. So I really think that's where significant gains have to happen. The US needs to be a leader the way it was in the 70s when it comes to global environmental problems if we're going to have any hope of addressing climate change. And other countries, developed countries like the US, have to take that lead. I think a lot of European nations already are, but there are some like the Netherlands that are considered among the laggards in even the European framework, that they were brought to task in a famous case called the Agenda case, and ultimately the government is now held to a higher standard. They need to do more to regulate climate change because they weren't doing enough. So I think it's going to be a mix of more regional and national efforts, and litigation is going to be a big part of that. There's all kinds of really exciting creative litigation theories right now that are seeking to hold not only governments accountable, but also the private sector. There's some really exciting cases pending against the fossil fuel industry right now, and even the factory farm industry in the US that are trying to get to that better place in terms of climate regulation through litigation.
So I've been doing some reading, and there was some suggestion that environmental damage and some of the animal treatment that is practiced around the world has contributed to epidemics in the past, and obviously the COVID-19 pandemic is the issue in everyone's mind at the moment when we're recording. How does animal law and environmental law intersect in ways that that cause sort of unforeseen issues? Are there other examples of that? And
Well, I think the two most prominent examples of that are this COVID-19 pandemic, where you see the notion of wet markets and wildlife trade are major problems, both for environmental law and animal law, and they intersect in a way that they produce major public health problems for humans. So both of those need to be regulated more effectively, and now is that moment in time where there's that political will and awareness about what needs to be done, and as quickly as possible, whereas when we're not in a pandemic, it's often lower on the priority list, again, because it involves animals and not humans. So the fact that we've got this intersection of both environmental and animal protection communities very much aligned on how to address, how to prevent or diminish future pandemics, I think that's a really great opportunity, one of many, where environmental law and animal law can come together to do more for mutual gain. And then the other piece is factory farms. So we're there, the documentary Cowspiracy really put this on the radar screen in 2014 about, and this is shocking to me, as an environmentalist myself, my whole career teaching environmental law, most environmental law professors and environmental lawyers are not as sensitive to the environmental impacts of our food system the way animal law people are. So I didn't become a vegetarian until I started teaching animal law. I was an environmental law professor for over 2 decades, and it didn't even occur to me that my food choices might have a big part to what I convey to the world about what matters in terms of individual choices and environmental protection. So the environmental and animal movements are aligning now in a way that hadn't been true before, because climate change is something that affects us all, and factory farms are a big source of methane emissions, huge contributor to global climate change, and it's going to be much more effective if environmental and animal advocates join forces to try to transition us away from the factory farm model. It's not only going to help us with climate change, it's going to help animal welfare, it's going to help environmental pollution concerns, and it's going to promote public health and reduce healthcare costs in the long run.
And what regulations do you think we can have, or what laws we can pass to to combat the factory farming?
Well, there's a really progressive bill that Cory Booker, a vegan in the US, he's a US senator, proposed last year. And basically it patterns itself after some environmental efforts that were successful in the 80s. One example would be stratospheric ozone depletion. So this was a highly successful global treaty when we identified that CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, were having this cause and effect relationship with the depletion of our stratospheric ozone layer. Our regulatory approach was, well, we can ignore this problem and just be dead in a century, or we can actively seek to phase out this destructive chemical and come up with an alternative that provides the benefits of air conditioning and refrigeration without trashing the stratospheric ozone. So it was a very successful mandatory phase-out regime of CFCs. So this factory farm legislation that Cory Booker is proposing is essentially that model, which would put a moratorium on any new factory farms or any expansions of existing factory farms, and ultimately require the phasing out of factory farms over a period of years, not too far into the future. And so that would seem unheard of even a few years ago, but the growing awareness about how this is a big piece of our climate solution, how there are many, many public health concerns associated with foods from factory farms, and the fortuitous timing of the explosion of the plant-based food industry. I mean, again, humans are very driven by what feels good, and the biggest challenge for that plant-based food revolution was it needs to taste good. And so the Impossible Burger, the Beyond Burger came out within the past year or so onto in widespread availability. And to the extent that someone can't really tell the difference between a traditional Whopper and an Impossible Whopper, they're going to go with the Impossible Whopper. they may as well do something good for their health and the environment if it costs about the same and tastes about the same. Whereas in the past it was, do you really want to eat tofu and sprouts instead of a steak? And most people said absolutely not. So there's a massive opportunity now to facilitate that transition away from factory farms. That wasn't true just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I really agree with that. Because so I've been vegetarian for like 2 months now. And
great.
yeah, it's essentially, so I've always wanted to become vegetarian, but the problem was I didn't know, like I thought I had to change my entire diet. But turns out now, like there are literally all kinds of burgers, all kinds of sausages. You can't even tell the difference.
Exactly.
So
and that's what we needed. We really needed the technology behind that movement to get us to have a fighting chance. Because I agree with you that if it's a massive personal sacrifice, some people will still do it when they're really motivated by those moral concerns that I just can't stand the thought of animals being slaughtered for my diet. But since we don't witness that on a day-to-day basis, and we're forced to choose between something that tastes good and something that doesn't, most of us are going to go with what tastes good and not make that transition. So I think, that's just a massive area of growth, socially, politically, legally right now. We're seeing a lot of litigation around the pushback from the meat and dairy industry against this tidal wave of interest in plant-based products. So one effort is called Gag Laws, and this is referencing how the meat industry says we have the exclusive right to use the term meat. So if you're selling a veggie burger and calling it a burger or calling it meat or calling it bacon, that's something that only we in the traditional animal agriculture industry can use, and we're going to sue you if you try to use that term to promote your plant-based products. And so those cases are going on right now. Unfortunately, they're losing. And there was a previous wave called ag-gag legislation that was in place, again, trying to exclude animal protection advocates from getting into factory farms to take photos and videos and become employees of those entities to get information about how they work. So the writing's on the wall. There have been unsuccessful efforts in that industry to maintain its stranglehold on our food system, and the walls are crumbling on a day-to-day basis.
So we've moved on a little bit from talking about big international changes in law to sort of individual action and how individuals intersect with the law or interact with the law even. To what extent can people get involved and take individual power over sort of the law in a way that benefits the environment? So I'm involved in a variety of activist groups that have sometimes found themselves not quite on the right side of the law. How can people spur on this process, or do you think protest and activism is part of the solution? It's quite a broad, messy question, but
no, it's very helpful because that's the challenge. There's so many people who want to do something to make a difference, and they're often asking me how. So of course your individual lifestyle choices are significant, but that's not enough for people who really want to change the world. So advocacy matters a lot. So there is absolutely room for protests, and they're necessary to raise public awareness, to get the attention of lawmakers. And so I'm getting more into that field than I ever have been. I'm involved in one that is essentially an activist public awareness raising in Canada for the Canadian government to refrain from subsidizing animal agriculture. And this isn't a traditional conference, talking head PowerPoint presentation. This is on the lawn of the Capitol in Ottawa to make sure that the voices are heard as directly as possible with megaphones and everything else and posters. So there's absolutely a need for that. But I think in a more traditional way, education is huge. So my son works for PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and he's involved in their humane education department, and basically he's raising awareness about the value of a plant-based diet in high schools and middle schools to as many places as he can get in the door. And so I think that community is much more receptive to that message and holds much more promise for the future than trying to convert a baby boomer like me when, we have one foot in the grave and we've got a lot of bad habits that we're trying to break. So I think the millennial and Generation Z generations are really the hope that way, that they are receptive, they're interested in this activist kind of change the status quo message, and I think that's really, really a big part of how we're going to get out of that.
And I was going to ask you this as well. Could the solution to, so we talked about the sort of the vegetarians are taking over very slowly the meat industry. Could the solution to climate change be this as well? So essentially, there comes a point where you see that green energy ends up being cheaper than fossil fuel, and then we'll see that transition through the free market as opposed to the governmental regulation.
And that's essentially what's going to happen, in my view, first, is that it really is about demand reduction. So the reason why, a big part of why the fossil fuel industry and the factory farm industry have a stranglehold on the market is because the demand is there for their products. So as the public awareness and education disseminates about the harms of these status quo enterprises and the benefits of the alternatives, green energy and plant-based foods, there's going to be this transition that almost occurs without regulation, because these businesses will not remain viable if the consuming public doesn't have an interest in them. So that's where decoupling the relationship between governments and those industries has to start. That's the first stage. They are succeeding in many ways. These industries are succeeding because the government is propping them up. So you've got extensive subsidies for all of these harmful industries. And so that's the first part where regulation has to make a difference. If the government can just stop subsidizing these industries, they would likely fail within the next decade. But even without that withdrawal of subsidies, I think ultimately the market demand for the products is going to get the transition to green energy and plant-based foods.
So you're generally more optimistic about a grassroots movement as a bottom up as opposed to top down approach.
Absolutely. I mean, ideally both need to be there, but I'm certain that something that is driven by the market is going to happen faster and it's going to stick compared to something that's mandated in a top-down way, because political administration changes will undo a lot of those top-down efforts, whereas if it's a change in culture, that's very hard to undo. I mean, we haven't had a cultural revolution since, China and Russia in many ways on a broad scale. That's much less likely. And to the extent that you have this sort of, this is the way we do things now. We want to sustain the planet, and we therefore embrace clean energy and plant-based eating. There's really going to be no way of turning that back politically if it happens from the bottom up. So I think that there's so much more hope there, but we're going to get there faster if it can be facilitated in a top-down way. And that's what I'm hopeful about, but I'm not convinced will happen as soon as it should.
Do you think there are any regulations that could incentivize innovation and speed it up?
Absolutely, and that's another role for government, to really reward good choices and punish bad choices. And so we have very few examples of that in the US. One that comes to mind immediately is a tax break for buying hybrid cars. And ultimately, if that were applied to many other choices, and I think we see it to some degree in other green energy choices as well, but not nearly enough. If we had that applied to plant-based foods. See, right now, the biggest challenge for plant-based foods is that they're expensive. When you look at a traditional fast food combo meal with meat products versus a fast food meal with plant-based foods, it's probably at least 30% more expensive to get the plant-based fast food than the traditional. So to the extent that there can be a transition of subsidizing animal agriculture to subsidizing plant-based food, and there's some proposals now at the state level that are doing that in the US, that would help significantly. That's how you get transitions in society. It's the whole carrot and stick tools that governments have at their disposal to encourage good behavior and discourage bad behavior. And likewise, a carbon tax on beef. To the extent you want to discourage bad behavior, sure, you can have that steak. It's going to be taxed at 30%, but go ahead and enjoy it if you want to pay that much for it.
Yeah, I know that there are various things at different universities in the UK which are sort of upping the prices of meat products and subsidising the veg products in the union shops, which I guess is a local level example. I wanted to ask, we touched on it a bit earlier, but obviously at the moment in the UK we're just emerging from the first stage of lockdown, and thousands of people have lost loved ones and thousands have lost jobs as well. Where do we go from here? And given that it might not be on the top of people's minds, taking action on environmental and animal law if they're just been made redundant, what opportunities and what challenges does sort of tragic situation that we find ourselves in present in this field?
Yeah, that's a very big, important question. And in many ways, I've thought more about this lately than ever in my career before the pandemic. Because when you think about what's going to motivate people to address climate change effectively, you have to look at human nature at a very basic level. Humans are very good at responding to emergencies, something that just happened today or yesterday or last week, and they're terrible about planning and making sacrifices for something that's perceived as off in the future. So I think one opportunity that the pandemic is offering us is, here's an example of a future you could have if you don't change your ways. That basically this could be the new normal for as long as we live, if we don't have some fundamental cultural shifts about some of the things that put us in this position. And so I think it's a great opportunity for environmental regulation, a great opportunity for animal regulation, and believe me, those advocates are seizing the moment. In many ways, it's a parallel to a human who has just suffered a heart attack. And you really have two choices with what you're going to do with the rest of your life. You can just resume the terrible habits that caused you to be in that condition and ultimately suffer your next heart attack in a few years, or you can assess that all you need to do is make some adjustments in your lifestyle to have a much longer and healthier life. And so I think as a global community, we're facing that choice right now in the wake of COVID. We saw that even though these lockdown measures are a blunt instrument, a temporary fix, we saw that fundamental changes to our status quo can get the results we need. That this lockdown of however many months we're looking at has created the most significant reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions since World War II in a single year. So, and the daunting part of that for our future is we have to continue at that level if we want to have any hope of avoiding the catastrophic climate change impacts that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is telling us we're in store for in 2030 and beyond. So it is a bit of a wake-up call. It's the shaking up we needed. It's kind of that last chance to say, are you ever going to change your status quo, or are you just going to brace for impacts until you die?
Wow. And so everyone is sort of aware of global warming or climate change. It's like the main topic. on environmental environmental catastrophes go. But what are some of the other environmental problems that we're causing at the moment that you think is not getting enough attention?
Well, I think one of those ties into our discussion, and that is species loss. So that is less on the radar of humans because it's not human. And this is a point that I make in my book that I didn't get to bring into the discussion yet. One way that caring about the voiceless is very important for humans' protection is that we need resilient ecosystems to be as protected as we can be as humans. So if we lose species, if we lose coastal wetlands and coral reefs, we as humans are much more vulnerable to what climate change has in store for us. So it's in our interest to be very protective against the risk of species loss, to be very protective against the loss of natural resources that serve as natural barriers to us with threats like sea level rise and storm surge. We want our coral reefs, we want our coastal wetlands to be intact. Even if we don't care about them in their own right, we should care about them for our sake. So I think that a lot of the things that are off the radar because climate change is such a daunting threat are somehow interconnected to climate change at a lower level. And I think it's really just what gets humans' attention the most is immediate threats to their public health and safety. So that's where we are right now. The pandemic has our attention because this is the most severe existential threat we've ever faced in our lifetimes. And climate change is getting close to that level. The problem with climate change's impacts is that it's here and it's there, and these are separated by months or years, and we just forget. We just rebuild and try to go back to normal. And the pandemic is showing us that you might not go back to normal in the way you do after a hurricane, like a Hurricane Sandy or Hurricane Katrina. It cost billions of dollars, but you basically got back to normal. But I think these other problems are important to see because climate change has so many faces, and it's unfortunate that we only see the most immediate threat face, so to speak, and we don't see those subsidiary faces that are every bit as threatening. It's kind of like a death by 1,000 cuts, and we're only concerned about the deepest cut and not all the other ones.
And I guess another factor with global warming and climate crisis is by the time that deepest cut comes, it's too late to take action to some extent.
Absolutely.
And when we're talking about the voiceless, so could you tell us who the voiceless are, or what are they? Could you run us through the voiceless, and then I have a follow-up from that.
Certainly. So those three categories of the voiceless: future generations of humans, wildlife, and natural resources. These are all connected to climate change as lacking a legal voice in our legal system in their own right, and essentially being further marginalized by climate change impacts. So current youth and future generations of humans don't have a voice with current legislative decision makers about how climate change should be regulated. Likewise, wildlife are treated as property, or certainly treated as not having a legal voice, as are natural resources. And to the extent that the integrity of these voiceless populations is further impaired, ultimately that reduces the resilience of our ecosystems such that adult humans are more imperiled. Right.
So with wildlife and natural resources, I can sort of understand why humans would keep it out of their moral circle, because they go, okay, we're humans, we're sentient. No, is it sentient? Yeah.
Yeah.
They're not. So we need to preserve ourselves. But with future generations, so I don't really understand, because most of the people who would, so most of the politicians, they're old, and they're probably not going to be impacted by climate change, but they probably like their grandchildren, like they like them. So I can't understand. Yeah, so I don't think so. Do you think it is that they don't care about their grandchildren, or they have convinced themselves it's not going to happen?
It's usually a combination of both of those things, but I think it comes back to human nature again. When you think about people who are in their 50s and 60s in the US and where they look to buy property, they're going to be very unwilling to pay high property taxes to support public schools in their town when they don't have kids in those schools. And that's a very selfish decision. As a citizen in the country or in that state, you should be very invested in paying high taxes to have a great public school system, so the next generation is going to carry on in a way that's going to be productive. But they don't. They're selfish. So even if they have grandkids, most people's decisions are made very myopically with economic short-term gains in mind. And so that's where, in many ways, climate denial is fueled, because climate denial is a way to justify our short-term selfish financial thinking. And if we just say climate change isn't real, or it's not going to happen in a really bad way until I'm dead, or even after my kids and grandkids are dead, that's just a way to assure yourself that your short-sighted thinking makes sense.
Do you think that's a restriction of human beings in general?
It is. I think that's exactly what's pushed us to this point of near global catastrophe on climate change. And I think that it's one of those things where I only see really good, inspiring things from humans in the wake of disasters. I only felt very connected to my fellow human being in my adult lifetime in the wake of 9/11 and in the wake of this pandemic. Every other time, everyone's doing their own thing, motivated by their self-interest, and really not aware of what else is going on around them. So I really feel that if we don't shift our way of thinking about our relationship to the planet we live on, it's just going to be an inevitable destruction awaiting us that is not going to be sustainable until we find another planet to live on. And I think it is a fundamental flaw in humans that we like our comfort zone. Just look at the fall of the Roman Empire. Too big to fail, right? Maybe not. And that's where the U.S. is right now. We're so fat and happy that we think we're invincible, and our comfortable lifestyle is going to last forever. And that's our tragic flaw in the Shakespearean play.
Could there be a cultural aspect to it as well? Because, for example, so Western countries are more individualistic. If you look at the East, they're more collectivist. So, for example, I know, for example, like China, Japan, Korea. So, even with regards to Corona, they managed to control it, take it into control much faster than the Western countries. And so, since we're on the top, so for example, I know that Japan has made a plan. It's not related to global warming, but it's with regards to World Cup. World Cup, we call it football, you call it soccer, I think. Yeah. Yep. So they've decided that they've made a plan to win the 2050 World Cup, and the politicians who made that decision won't be alive when the World Cup takes place, and the players who will win Japan the match aren't born yet.
So
yet they managed to, and Japan is a democratic country as far as I know, right?
Yes.
They managed to do such a thing. So how is it that? So what is it about? First of all, am I being overly optimistic about Japan, or have they got something right?
Well, I think you've put your finger on this idea of both social and political underpinnings to this idea of being selfish and focused on short-term individual gain versus what's good for the larger whole. And yeah, sometimes that's political when we have socialist governments as opposed to traditional democracies, and sometimes that's cultural. You're right about the East being very much about the strength of the collective, the family, and not so much the individual. That much of your big and small decisions in life are motivated with that kind of good of the collective in mind, and not so much your own interest. So I think that World Cup example is a cultural reality that there can be this kind of commitment to something that's in the interest of the larger entity as a whole, and be kind of working as a team toward that, even though that might not be in everybody's interest. It's something that's good overall. And you'd never see that in the U.S. There's just too much very short-term self-interest in how our culture works now. And it's also why you see so many elderly in assisted living, that they're just shipped off to nursing homes because they're not useful to those short-term ways of financial gain thinking that Americans engage in. Whereas if you look at the role of the elderly in Eastern cultures, they're revered. They're part and parcel of the daily lives of young and middle-aged adults.
And do you think we'll have is the only way really to have a cultural change, or we can wait till maybe free market can fix the problems?
Yeah, I really think the market's going to be a big part of the solution, and I think that there has to be government facilitation for it to work in time. I mean, we have a clock ticking in the background now that we didn't 2 or 3 decades ago in terms of how fast this cultural shift has to occur. And so it can occur without government involvement, but it probably won't happen fast enough. So those 2 dimensions really need to be working simultaneously. And I think that if you look at other cultural shifts, I mean, how quickly a flip of a switch occurred within my lifetime, for instance. So I grew up in a culture where at least half of the adults I knew smoked. And 20 years later, smoking was almost vilified as much as doing drugs. I mean, it was just so culturally marginalized. Once we learned that secondhand smoke could kill non-smokers, you are a villain if you're smoking in public. People used to be able to smoke on airplanes. Now you can't smoke on airplanes, you can't smoke in your office, you can't smoke in restaurants, you can't even smoke near buildings, outside. So that cultural shift, in the grand scheme of things, happened in the blink of an eye. And the cultural shift to clean energy and plant-based foods has to happen even faster, and it might. And we need all hands on deck for that to happen, both governmental and the market to work as effectively as possible.
Any questions, Nathan?
No, don't think so. All asked out.
Perfect. So, for anyone listening, if they want to engage in a practice that would help us with regards to climate change and environment and animal rights, what would you tell them? What would you encourage them to do?
Well, I think it's really a combination of what we've discussed. So virtually every decision every individual makes has consequences when it comes to carbon footprints. So it's about being conscious of those decisions in ways that you weren't in the past. And so this doesn't require everyone to become vegan tomorrow. That's not going to happen. But ultimately, making choices that reduce the amount of meat in your diet, and awareness of all the other sources of protein that are not animal derived meat-based sources, that's important. your transportation decisions, and I think Europe across the board is way ahead of the US in this regard. You've got public transportation available everywhere. We don't. So in the US, it's about getting off of our car addiction. It's about getting off of our McMansion addiction. You don't have to live in a 5-bedroom house if you have 2 people in your household. And so there's more of a move back to the city in the US, which is also a very carbon-friendly choice. If you're living in a smaller space with walking to the things you need as opposed to driving or even taking public transit, that's ideal. There's even flight shaming going on in Europe that is only starting to take hold in the US, because we need to take flights more than you do, but ultimately we still have some options to do things remotely. And that's perhaps one of the best products of the COVID crisis, is that I've given so many webinars in the past month that I could have been doing before this hit, and it just wasn't on my radar screen. Now I will. I still love having in-person interaction. I don't want that to stop, but as a conscious carbon footprint kind of decision, I'm going to be thinking much harder about doing webinars in lieu of in-person speaking engagements as a way of reducing my carbon footprint. So it's about just thinking through all of your individual choices, just about anything you do, even your investments. For those of us who have a few dollars to invest, socially conscious green investing decisions are also a part of ways you can do the right thing.
And a final question. If you could change one thing about the world, what would it be?
Self-absorption. I think that's the root of all evil, that we as humans are wired to be most attentive about our own needs, but we also have a moral fabric that we can choose to engage more than we do, to care about others as a way of our contribution to humanity. And I think there's more of that happening now, more of a need for it for sure. And that would be my appeal to everybody, whether it's about protecting the environment, protecting animals, or even protecting yourselves. Be aware of your fellow human being and their needs. The world involves more than you.
Perfect. Any final words? Anything else to add? So I'll put the links to all your books in the description of the video. Please go check them out. And yeah, thank you very much for coming on. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. Just a thrill to have this dialogue with you.
It's been really interesting. Thank you.
Have a good day.
Much. Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, guys. It was our interview with Professor Abate. We found it really interesting. Do let us know what you thought about it. All comment down below. And this is my second interview with, to my left, my guest co-host Nathan Strafty. Tell me, Nathan, what did you think about it?
I found that really interesting. It was fascinating to hear more about international animal and environmental law, because see, I knew about the Geneva Convention and the European Court of Human Rights, but I didn't know about the various laws and mechanisms for protecting the environment. Particularly what he was saying about rivers gaining protection in law. That was
that one
really
a bit. Do you not think it would be easier to say, okay, so the river is hurting humans, as opposed to so polluting the river, right? Or like like causing the river to dry up is causing harm to either current humans or future humans. To me, that seems like an easier argument to make than, oh, the river has a right.
I guess that might be an easier argument to make, but I think the point he was trying to make was that won't be as all-encompassing, and it doesn't account for the fact that the river has value independent of people. So perhaps there's a situation where damaging the river doesn't necessarily harm people, or the benefit to the people outweighs the harm it does to the river. Under your argument, then there wouldn't be a leg to stand on if it's not harming the people. Whereas this way of looking at it accounts for the fact a river has value, natural value, and is important to protecting ecosystems and things that may not relate to people, and it's all encompassing. So rather than just pollution or just water supplies, this accounts for everything that might affect the river, I think is one of the points he was trying to make.
Right. Yeah. I think it would be even if you are to argue, right, not in terms of humans, but it would be easy to argue for the ecosystem than it would be to argue literally for the river. I don't know. Or maybe it's a step in the right direction. Maybe you need to go a bit too far that way so you can balance out.
I guess that then you're asking, how do you define the ecosystem? The river is an ecosystem, but it's also part of a wider ecosystem of the plains or the forests or the cities it's travelling through. Whereas a river is something very easily definable, but also natural.
Yeah, and also, so how do you define what's good for a river, what's bad for a river?
Yeah, I guess that's difficult, but you can have parameters like dissolved oxygen content, which is very important for having marine life. There's fish in the water. You can have there are keystone species that are indicators of the health of ecosystems. There are things like if you've got a lot of ammonia, which comes from fertilizers in a river, that contributes to eutrophication. So you could choose some parameters, I think, and say, this is bad, this is good. Like with the air, we say there are legal limits for how much nitrogen dioxide is supposed to be in it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. But even if you're arguing for the river, I think at the end you're still arguing for the people. Even if it's just the beauty of the river, is so people can see its beauty, can experience it, like future generations can. Even if it's just the beauty, not any, like, it's still you're trying to preserve something for the human, not anything for the river itself.
Possibly, but I wouldn't want to separate humans from.
Wow. Okay, that's deep.
I think that's what he was saying about the Speciesist Divide and people.
Right.
We're not apart from our environment. We're deeply affected by it, and we need it to continue to survive. So you are doing it for the environment, you're doing it for the river, but you are also doing it for yourself and future generations. And those things aren't things that you can take apart, I don't think.
Yeah, that's a very. I mean, yeah, I agree with that. But I don't think you can get people to agree with that. I don't know. I just.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's the cultural change that you mentioned we needed, and you did say it would be easy.
And with regards to animal rights, his answer was very interesting. That, we can't. So our moral circle is basically, even the most, well, up till recently at least, right? The most liberal of people, you'd say, what's your moral circle? It would be all humans. It wouldn't. You wouldn't get anyone extending it to all living. I mean, to be fair, Buddhists and stuff.
I disagree. There's every religious text has some idea of stewardship in it. In various, to use the Christian expression. So that's in the New Testament. and the Old Testament, there's the idea of tikkun olam, which is caring for the world, which is a Hebrew expression. I'm not sure about in Islam. I think that
There is one as well.
I think that it's actually only my view would be that it's only recently, when we've tried to separate people from nature, that has become a way of looking at things. So I think that's not a particularly well informed view, but
that's a good point. That's a good point. And I guess by recently I meant recent, very recent, not in the I wasn't taking into account the I was just saying past 100 years. That was my span of time. That's very interesting. How
the thing that I found, the one thing that I wasn't convinced by was the free market. What Professor he said about the free market, I'm a little bit skeptical that it's going to produce the solutions.
I mean, it is doing it for the meat industry.
To some extent, yeah, but as you mentioned, that the large companies are taking the smaller ones to court to try and suppress their progress, but he said they've been failing. They have been failing, so maybe it's working there. But like we talked with the guy from the International Energy Agency, Neil Hurst, about BP and Shell have been investing in action against carbon taxes and stuff like that, which would damage them but benefit other smaller companies. So I don't know, I'm just not entirely convinced that
I think they'll try their best. What it's just we can overcome their because if you think about it, like cigarettes in 60s and 70s, they were big industry. They were huge. They had control over everything. Now we've managed to pretty much we've either, like in Australia, they're literally finding this cigarette industry. Like we've I think it's fair to say, as our today's guest, we've defeated like the cigarette industry.
It's taken us
more than it should have.
70 years, maybe. You think?
Well, there was a period where we went too short. Like it was a bit like the early climate change, like 70s climate. Like people went. There was a point of debate where people were saying, and then there was a point. It's very similar to climate change. This cigarette thing. Yeah, there was a period where the cigarette companies were funding research that was saying, "Oh yeah, cigarette is bad for you," but they were underplaying how bad it is. So it was very similar to our current.
Yeah, but my point is that it's taken us 70 years or so to defeat the cigarette industry. We've not got that scale of time with climate change. We need to take action now, because if we wait 70 years, we'll have had 3, 4, 5 degrees of temperature rise, which will put Kiribati and the Maldives underwater. Some islands have already been lost. So, like, I hope he's right about sort of the market being able to fix it, because I don't foresee a large change in that easily or anytime soon, but I'm just a bit skeptical and think that sort of the more
I think you might be surprised. Go for it. What?
Just I tend towards
you just more skeptical.
Yeah, I tend towards the sort of eco-socialist way of thinking more, I think.
Well, you might be surprised that like the reason I'm holding this view was because of was from the previous guest, actually. Because you remember there was a part of the conversation where I asked him about the conundrum, the climate change, and he said, "Oh, there is less of a conundrum now." And I was like, would you attribute that to the innovation and technological advancements that have taken place? And he said yes. So that was where I was like, okay, you know what? We're making progress.
Yeah, I think that we are definitely making progress, and the technological innovation is like a big part. That I was reading recently that there's Julia Steinberger, who's a professor at Leeds, actually saying that there's 3 key parts to tackling the crisis, which would be technological innovation, sort of cultural changes, and my memory's awful. I forgot the third one.
That's fine. Tell me, I might be able to figure out. Let's figure out.
Well, it was I can't remember.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry.
So, yeah, I think that technological innovation is happening, and that's good. But we also need the cultural changes and
government regulation
as well.
Right. Yeah. I think that the eco-socialism thing is interesting. We need to bring someone to talk about that.
Yeah, some of the Alex Phillips, who's was an MEP for the Green Party, is now maybe mayor or councillor for the Green Party somewhere in the south of England. She's one of an interesting sort of eco-socialist voice, and there's a few others as well.
We'll see. We'll have them on. If they're coming, we'll have them on.
Have to give people a break from a climate crisis for a while, maybe.
Well, to be fair, this is the least busy they've been, right? With regards to climate change, it's like,
yeah.
Anyway, do you have any final words?
Go vegetarian.
Go vegetarian, guys. Look at us, too. Look at how cheerful we are. Want to become cheerful? Try some veg. Not weird at all.
Convince me.
Yeah, no. I think it's a good idea. I know you're a very greedy person. I'm a very greedy person. It's starting to taste good. You can't tell. Try. Right, try. No, don't become vegetarian, right? Just try out. Add a bit more vegetarian meat. It's called Quorn. The brand is Quorn, isn't it? Try it. Yeah, buy some of those. Have it. Like, say, okay, I'm going to have it for one meal. Then see what you can do. Even if you reduce it, if you say, okay, I'm going to have these days of the week, I'm going to be a vegetarian. That's progress. You're helping the environment. That's better than having meat every day. Try it out, guys. Okay, I'll let me shoot your Twitter feed again. Pew, pew, pew. Okay, that's enough. Yeah, let's show the heart sign. Okay. Bye-bye. Very good, very good.
Right.